whether it's Legend of the Red Dragon, Super Mario Bros., or Tetris. Well, maybe not Tetris, but let's just say, from the beginning, many developers have had a desire to tell stories through their games, and while this desire has always existed, the ability to do so effectively has been somewhat limited by technological constraints. Unless one is willing to go full text-based game, but let's face it, that's not much fun. We want flashy visual effects, and explosions, blockbuster set pieces, and spaceships. In our last video, we discussed the importance and value of game settings and options. This video is meant to be both helpful and inspirational to any developer that desires to increase the value of their game with a story of their own. However, there are a few things we need to make provision for in advance. We don't want to get too far off into the weeds, but it's important to establish some method of distinguishing one kind of game from another in order to recognize which writing style is best in a given situation. These are things that go beyond the obvious generalizations like Monster in the House or Boy Meets Girl. With video games, there are other factors to consider. For our purposes, and just as an illustration, we will examine 4 different types of game design and how they lend themselves to more complex storytelling. But we certainly don't want to fall victim to general rules. As was mentioned in the previous video, general rules should be avoided whenever possible, in favor of more actual guidelines. The last thing we want to do is stifle creativity. For instance, the open world adventure offers writers the most freedom to construct epic sagas, whereas the guided adventure is better suited for tighter, more linear scripts. This clearly isn't always the case. A guided adventure can be every bit as epic and saga as any story told in open world games, while tighter stories can and should thrive in the open world environment as well. What's important is that we understand these things in order to achieve the right balance. And there's no better way to understand it than by looking at a few examples from each of our 4 designs: open world, less open world, guided linear, and guided non-linear. The names of the designs are mostly arbitrary. You can call them whatever you want, so long as you know what you mean. In this illustration, examples of open world adventures will include titles such as Assassin's Creed Odyssey, Starfield, and Little Kitty Big City. Less open world includes games like Indiana Jones and the Great Circle, RoboCop Rogue City, and Stray. Guided linear adventures are games like Bright Memory Infinite, Fear, Sulaco, or Star Trek Resurgence, while non-linear would be something like Trepang 2, Angry Video Game Nerd Adventures, or even Darkwing Duck and Mega Man for the NES. As far as writers are concerned, map size has nothing to do with whether or not a game is open world. Hogwarts Legacy might offer a much larger map than Little Kitty Big City, but both games function the same way in that players are tasked with the main quest along with a variety of side quests. We use the term variety a bit loosely there. What distinguishes these titles from less open world is not the size of the map, but the relative freedom players are afforded in moving about. In open world adventures, players are typically free to revisit any location previously discovered or unlocked, while less open world advises players to complete any unfinished business they may have in a particular location before moving on, as they will not have a chance to do so later in the game. The Great Circle and Rogue City are perfect examples. Both guided linear and non-linear largely forego exploration in favor of challenging players to reach the end of a level, such as in platformers and traditional first-person shooters. On the surface, guided linear adventures may appear to be best suited for the traditional Hollywood screenplay, but that doesn't mean non-linear adventures are incapable of telling decent stories as well, as we see with Trepang 2. It's not the deepest, most intellectual story ever told, but it works for what the game is, and it serves our purpose well by illustrating the importance of taking the writing process seriously. When we consider the fact Trepang 2 was developed by 4 young adults that were learning on the fly, it becomes a little easier to appreciate the quality of their writing, and it's obvious they took the writing seriously. Each of the 4 designs have strengths and weaknesses. When we examine Stray, we find an absolute masterwork of combined storytelling and game development. It serves as one of the very best examples of why video games are a multi-billion-dollar industry and the #1 form of entertainment. Players are introduced to a world of humanoid robots that exist in a perpetual state of imitation as they attempt to mimic the lives of their long-extinct creators. They possess no sense of curiosity or adventure. They are content to remain in an isolated environment, imprisoned by their fear of danger and a menace on the other side of the wall, though none of this is ever explicitly stated or made overtly obvious. It is only when the player discovers this for themselves that they realize how profoundly meaningful the story really is. The very thing that makes us human, those traits that are lacking in the inhabitants of this world, are what compel us to complete the game. Yet the player does not control a human character. It is in fact a cat, the very clue that unlocks the mystery and meaning of the story. Stray was actually the game that inspired me to do game reviews back when I did them, but after reviewing more than 20 games, I deleted all my videos because I was starting to sound like a broken record. Not because I lacked the ability to write a coherent review, but because of all the games I reviewed, Stray and Shady Part of Me were the only two that really had anything meaningful to say. And all I could really say about Shady Part of Me was that you kind of have to experience it for yourself. It wasn't quite as disturbing as Senua's Sacrifice, but if you enjoy getting mind-fucked by dialogue, I highly recommend them both. The lack of things interesting or new to talk about isn't just what inspired me to stop doing reviews, it's also what inspired me to create this series. Modern gaming may suffer from many serious problems, but none of them are insurmountable with the correct application of thought and inspiration. Along with affording players the option to customize their gaming experience, developers do well in recognizing the importance of quality writing. Understanding the difference in game design is important, not because different designs offer more or less freedom when it comes to writing, but because each design has specific writing requirements that should be met, placing more or less responsibility on the writer or writing staff. And this is always the case, regardless of what designation you assign them. Now, to be clear, it's certainly possible for a solitary scribe to accomplish all of the writing in a massive open-world adventure, but I imagine it would be rather time-consuming, and so for that, it's advisable to assemble a team of writers. This may sound like common sense, but given that every side mission appears to be copied and pasted from one game to the next, I would venture out on a limb and suggest this is not as straightforward as it sounds. It's far better to cut the fat and get rid of any monotonous or repetitious side quests than to have gamers refer to your game as having filler. Filler is a very bad word in the gaming industry, and players recognize it when they see it. Filler is synonymous with low quality, low IQ, and lack of imagination. Hogwarts Legacy certainly isn't perfect, but it is one of the very best examples of quality writing when it comes to side quests. These little mini-missions are no less important than the main quest and should always be treated with respect and dignity. Tasking players with fetching coffee, as we see in Starfield, is just sinful. Sending them off to retrieve lost or stolen items, as we see in every other open-world game, is old and tired and has been done to death. Each side quest should have a compelling story of its own, or as we see in Hogwarts Legacy, link back to the main quest in some interesting or thought-provoking way. Sebastian and the curse on his sister play an important role in the A story, but many of the quests surrounding the two characters are optional, making them side quests. This brings us not only to the B story, as that is what we would call that, but it also brings us to the most important section of this video, resources for aspiring writers. Gamers understand that video game development is hard work, and learning to develop games is very time-consuming. It requires very specific training in very specific areas, and writing is not one of them. Writing for video games can rightly be considered mostly uncharted territory, and we understand that not every developer has time or can afford to take creative writing classes, but there are alternatives. The internet is a wonderful tool and a great place to start when one is attempting to self-educate. Right here on YouTube, we have a plethora of channels dedicated to helping writers hone their craft and polish their stories. For writing fiction in general, but fantasy more specifically, I recommend Brandon Sanderson. If orcs and dwarfs are your thing, he's the guy to see. But of course, his advice can be applied to any genre of writing, and most of the lectures featured on his channel were filmed on location in a college classroom. For science fiction or sci-fi horror, Quinn's ideas is a veritable goldmine and shouldn't be overlooked. Quinn offers unique and valuable insight into the world of science fiction, and I especially like his work on the subject of anxiety and the human mind. To make your bad guy badder, and you should, Analyzing Evil is a helpful resource, and there's certainly no shortage of true crime channels on YouTube if you just want to delve into the mind of true criminals, or the brave men and women of law enforcement that bring them to justice. Additionally, you could head on over to the bookstore and pick up a copy of Save the Cat by Blake Snyder. This book will teach you about the 3-act structure, as well as story beats and the importance of their timing. Or you could deep dive the subject with Robert McKee's series of books, including topics such as story, dialogue, character, and action. These are all invaluable resources for the aspiring writer at a fraction of the cost of taking creative writing courses. I highly recommend all of them, especially the books, as I have read them all over the years, and they have elevated my understanding of creative writing in ways I never could have imagined. If nothing else, this is the most critical and valuable piece of advice I can give on the subject of writing. Familiarize yourself with the hero's journey. This is required learning if you're to have any hope of ever becoming a decent writer. Writing in video games has been neglected for far too long, as the medium is more capable than any other when it comes to delivering thought-provoking and compelling stories. It's time for video game developers to start thinking about writing and storytelling seriously, because I can assure you that in my 40 years of gaming, the best stories I've experienced were through video games. Occasionally, we find a diamond in the rough that has the power to move us to tears, teach us something new, or simply fill us with joyous wonder. Happy gaming, and thanks for watching.